Hello and welcome to Talk 200, a lecture and podcast series to celebrate the University of Manchester's bicentenary year. Our 200th anniversary is a time to celebrate 200 years of learning, innovation and research, 200 years of our incredible people and community, 200 years of global influence. In this series, you'll be hearing from some of the nation's foremost scientists, thinkers and social commentators, plus many other voices from across our university community as we explore the big topics affecting us all. In this episode, Nazir Afzal, Chancellor of the University of Manchester and former Chief Crown Prosecutor for North West England, discusses inequalities in access to justice and the steps towards fairer treatment in the legal system. Discover the limits to equality within our legal system and how, in the face of recent scandals in the UK and overseas, we can widen access to justice.
Good afternoon and welcome to this special event, the second of our Talk 200 series of exciting lectures and podcasts which are going on throughout 2024, our university's bicentenary year. This one's especially significant as it falls within our bicentenary festival, Universally Manchester. We hope that we'll see you at other events across the weekend. I'm not only delighted to welcome those who have joined us in person for this event, but also those joining online. Our 200th anniversary is an opportunity to reflect on our past, celebrate our present, and look to the future. And the Talk 200 series invites listeners to be part of the journey. Building on the success of our lockdown lectures and the annual Cockcroft-Rutherford lectures, this series features some of the nation's foremost scientists, thinkers, historians, and social commentators, as well as many other voices from across the community. Talk 200 is a chance to celebrate our people, inspiring staff and students, pioneering academics, and notable figures. Through the lectures and podcasts, we have a diverse lineup of guests who are providing insights on a range of themes central to our university's purpose and values, including social responsibility, groundbreaking discovery, and civic engagement. The Talk 200 series will comprise of 4 in-person and live-streamed lectures and 6 recorded podcast episodes, which you'll be able to access on our bicentenary web pages and the usual podcast channels. The first live lecture was with Professor Chris Whitty, looking at the main drivers of inequalities and disparities in health. That's available to watch again via our website. Our next lecture will be with our brilliant Professor Mike Shaver. This time it will take place in London, so look out for that one. Our distinguished alumnus and Manchester aficionado, Andy Spinoza, is hosting the podcast for this series. Topics so far being innovation in Manchester and energy and climate change, with contributions from our leading academics in this area. So be sure to seek them out and tune in. We're delighted to begin today with a lecture from Nazir Afzal OBE, our esteemed Chancellor and former Chief Crown Prosecutor for North West England. Most recently, Nazir was Chief Executive of the country's Police and Crime Commissioners. During his 24-year career in these roles, he has prosecuted some of the most high-profile cases in the country and advised on many others, leading nationally on several legal topics, including violence against women and girls, child sexual abuse, and honor-based violence. He had responsibility for more than 100,000 prosecutions each year. His prosecutions of the so-called Rochdale grooming gang and hundreds of others were groundbreaking and changed the landscape of child protection. His lecture today, The Limits to Equality, Access to Justice and Scandal, will discuss inequalities in access to justice and steps towards fairer treatment in the legal system. Once Nazir has given his lecture, we will move on to a panel discussion in which a selection of experts will further discuss issues within this topic. Chaired by Claire McGourlay, Professor of Legal Education in the University of Manchester, the panel will then delve into the disparities in access to justice and discuss how we can possibly chart a path towards fairer treatment within the legal sphere and the challenges that poses. Our superb panelists tonight include exonerated postmaster Tom Hedges, barrister and advocate Thalia Marar, who played a leading role in the UK COVID-19 inquiry and the Grenfell inquiry, and Suzanne Gower, who is a PhD lecturer, PhD researcher and lecturer here, and former managing director of the legal charity Appeal, a great collection of expertise. Without further ado, can I please ask Nazir Afzal to make his way to the stage.
Thank you very much indeed, Luke, and thank you so much for all of you attending and also those of you watching online who include Thalia's family in Montego Bay, Jamaica. And you can rest assured that's where most of us would like to be tonight, but nonetheless, welcome to you as well. It's a real pleasure to be able to share a few of my thoughts on this. My thoughts have germinated, I think, in the last decade or so. I left prosecuting in 2015, and one of the reasons I left prosecuting was I felt that every prosecution was a failure because somebody had been harmed to get to me. And I wanted to move more into the sphere of prevention and ultimately trying to see whether we could actually improve the system that I was part of. And that in itself is the problem, that we call the criminal justice a system rather than a service. Because when you have a system, you're only focused on process, how things are done. You know, arrest, charge, conviction, sentence, that kind of thing, rather than the people in it, the humanity, which I think is missing. And we're going to hear undoubtedly from people like Tom this afternoon around when it goes wrong. And it does go wrong more frequently than perhaps we appreciate. When I first became a lawyer a long time ago, 1989, one of my first cases, or first group of cases I was dealing with was the West Midlands Serious Crime Squad, which is of police officers that were there's no other way of putting it, they were fitting up suspects. They were writing confessions for them on statements and then submitting it. And I worked for a firm of solicitors called Glaziers, who back then were doing some great work in miscarriage of justice. And I learned my trade working with the partners and others in that field, and recognized then that there was more needed to be done. But again, I focused entirely on prosecution when I moved into prosecution, and I didn't realize what it was that was happening in our system. Additionally, I worked in central London for 20 odd years. Pretty much early on in my career as a prosecutor, we had Stephen Lawrence's terrible murder and the immediate aftermath of that, or the lack of an aftermath, namely no prosecution for 15 years. That, I think, in itself, again, was a steep learning curve for all of us around, that perhaps justice doesn't follow automatically. It needs some actual, put something being done about it rather than expecting somebody to do their job. And I think I can't have this conversation without, I'm not going to be party political because we're in a general election, but to try and describe where we are now as a country when it comes to our justice system. We have a broken justice system. It is broken in every respect. We have lost 500,000 years of police experience. That's 20,000 police officers times 25 years. We've lost 600 courtrooms. We've lost 800 police stations. We've lost thousands of probation officers and victim support workers. There is poor morale throughout the system. The lowest public confidence, I think, in my 30 years in working in the justice system. The conviction rate for sexual offences, is 1.8%. Turn it around, that means 98.2% of those accused of sex offending will not be charged with a crime. There have been increases in domestic abuse, increases in violence against women and girls, low police detection rates, online fraud is going unpunished, hate crime is going up, knife crime is going up, prison is failing to rehabilitate. The longest time now ever from offence to charge since in all of my years, the highest delays in trials being finalised, the highest backlogs in trials being heard, and NGOs are suffering because they just don't have the resources. That's where we are right now. So when we're discussing, as we are discussing, what's wrong with our system, we have to recognize where we are right now is not going to make it any better. Because if anything, it's going to make things worse. And I try to understand, or try to appreciate. I have the good fortune. Talia, I know, worked with the Grenfell families. So did I. I carried out the review of London Fire Brigade culture about 18 months ago, and I had the privilege of meeting the Grenfell families. And I saw in them 72 people, 72 families, quite frankly, who felt that the country had let them down, and that there was nothing that would come from that. And we're 7 years in now, and to date there has not been one person arrested, never mind charged. And so they wonder about accountability. And that's the question that I keep asking myself, is whether or not there really is accountability in our system. And of course, the experience of people like the Grenfell families, like the Hillsborough families, like the infected blood families, you can go on and list them. The disproportionate or unfortunate use of joint enterprise. There are so many different ways in which miscarriages of justice occur, where people are brought into the system and the system just follows the process without anybody saying, stop, let's have a look. And of course, then it links into something I know others will touch on this afternoon, is that the accountability must come from a legal duty to tell people what's going on. We often use the term, why aren't there any whistleblowers? Why should there be whistleblowers? The system itself should call itself up to scrutiny. There should be, as we undoubtedly will discuss, a duty of candor, where people are mandated to speak up about what's going wrong in their systems. Right now, as I speak to you, I'm now carrying out the independent review of the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and my report is due on the 9th of July. It would have been a couple of weeks earlier, but there is something happening on July the 4th, which has delayed that. But again, that is the world's largest regulator. 808,000 nurses and midwives. And you will hear, unfortunately, I can't give you more detail, that had there been a duty of candor, had whistleblowers been protected, we wouldn't be where we are today and where the NMC is today. So what's wrong? What's wrong with our system? And there's so much wrong. There is an inequality of arms. So there are those who, we talk about legal costs being really expensive. We're then reliant upon people working pro bono, people working for nothing. Legal costs are expensive. The high legal fees that we have are preventing low-income individuals from obtaining representation. That can't be right. At the same time, the state or these large institutions, such as the post office, have all the resources. I'm assisting somebody I can't talk about against somebody in power right now, and that person in power has said in no uncertain terms to this person, I have all the means at my disposal to keep this going forever, and you haven't. And that shouldn't be right. There should be an equality of arms to enable people to be able to represent themselves or be represented through that. Before that, there's the access to legal aid itself. The access to legal aid has been struck down over the last few years. It's now, there are so many unrepresented defendants appearing in our courtrooms. And they are what they're doing. They're often pleading guilty because that's the easiest thing to do. You'll hear more about that later from Tom. Race and ethnicity is another challenge when it comes to inequality. You are 9 times more likely, if you're a black person, to be stopped and searched by a police than a white person. You are, as a black person, more likely to be arrested, more likely to be charged, more likely to be convicted, more likely to be sentenced to prison than a white person on the same evidence in this country. Well, that surely can't be right. Then we've got the more general things around language barriers. We've had a massive impact on the availability of interpreting services. So many cases fail now because the interpreter's not there, or on many occasions I've seen judges and district judges and magistrates say to the defendant, we can adjourn this case to get you an interpreter, but let's go ahead anyway. And that person doesn't understand a word that's been said to them. I could talk about gender bias. Again, I don't have enough time, but you have to recognize, and we do recognize, I mentioned the 1.8% figure when it comes to victims of sexual violence, that there is a bias in the system when it comes to women and the way that they're treated, and a lack of understanding from legal professionals, really, about what's happening within the family, what's happening when it comes to sexual violence, what's happening when it comes to domestic abuse. 1 in 4 women in this country suffer domestic abuse. 1 in 5 women in this country suffer sexual assault. 2 women every week are killed by their partners and ex-partners. 10 women every week take their own lives because of the abuse they're suffering. But I can assure you that judges, magistrates, professionals in the system don't routinely, consistently know what they're dealing with. And they don't seek expert advice and guidance and support when they should do. And where they look for it, the NGOs aren't there anymore, or the NGOs aren't properly funded. I'm the patron of 9 women-led NGOs all working in this field, and they spend probably half their time trying to fundraise. I'd rather they spend 100% of their time trying to help the victims that they are meant to be supporting or they are supporting. Then there is the geographic inequality, the rural versus urban. If you're living in a rural environment, say in Cumbria, I remember when I was Chief Prosecutor for North West England, in Cumbria we, as in the Ministry of Justice, closed lots of magistrates' courts. It made it a 50-mile journey for some people to travel to a magistrate's court for a hearing with no transport, nothing like they have on the tube in London. So you have those kinds of issues which undoubtedly will impact upon them. And of course, when you're in a close-knit community in a village somewhere in whatever part, the reality is if you make an allegation against your partner, for example, this is a real case, everybody in the village tries to dissuade you from going ahead. And that's another issue that we just don't have any research on or we have any understanding of. Infrastructure, I've touched on it. There isn't any infrastructure in remote court when it comes to access to justice in certain large parts of our country. There's the other inequality around educational awareness. There's a legal literacy in this country, I'm afraid, is really low. That's why you see people on social media saying the law says this when it doesn't. And they go to social media when they don't have the means themselves to know what the law should be, or they wait for Martin Lewis to tell them on his program or something. What we need to have is access to information. You should have access to information. It should be legal literacy in your curriculum. It enables you to understand from a very early age what your rights are and potentially what you could do differently, where you can seek guidance and seek support. We thought we'd solve disability access. You go to any courtroom in the country and think about how difficult it is for somebody who's disabled to be able to access either the courts or the legal offices. The accommodation itself, outdated. So many of our courtrooms in this country, they've got roofs leaking. They're falling apart. And the idea that somebody who's got disability can come in and do so without being impeded is absolute nonsense. So we've got significant issues there around simply the way we treat disabled people in our system, never mind how the prisons deal with them. Immigration status, I can't go without mentioning immigration status. We still have no recourse to public funding for so many people, particularly women who are suffering abuse. They don't have the ability to access legal services for free. And that means that, again, the perpetrator can abuse them, and knowing that that's the case. And there are, of course, fear of repercussions because of immigration status. Why would they? If you are the victim of modern slavery, technically, you are the victim. Therefore, you should be treated as a victim and you be provided with support. But they're frightened, and they undoubtedly should be frightened, given the public discourse, that if they come forward, they will simply be deported from the country, and the perpetrator who's put them in that position will undoubtedly walk free. And of course, the immigration law itself is complex. I thank God I'm not doing immigration law. But that changes like every other week. Criminal justice bills every year. Claire, how many? I mean, literally, there's tinker with the criminal law like nobody's business. And the promise of a Royal Commission that was given in 2019 manifesto, by the way, never came off. And so we're still tinkering with the legal system, but all that does is make it even more complicated for the average citizen, never mind the average citizen, for the average lawyer. The youth and elderly, young people, not only are they subjected to potential national service, they're also being told to literally suffer. They undoubtedly are treated poorly by the services that were there for them aren't there anymore. Children's services, youth services are struggling to provide all manner of support both to the victims and to those accused. And the system has a lack of understanding, really, of particularly youth issues, but also elderly. The elderly themselves have additional barriers which are not being faced. And there's technological barriers. The digital world, now these days, more and more post-COVID, we'll do the hearing on Zoom. What the hell's Zoom? I don't have Wi-Fi. All those kinds of things that we seem to think that we've taken for granted. Digital technology is not there. The infrastructure is not there. The system, when I tried to bring in digital printing 12 years ago in the CPS, I did. I said what we would do is we'll send our file digitally to the court. The police said, no, we can't do it. We'll have to send you a paper copy. The judges said, we need a paper copy too. The whole idea, but the system wasn't working as a system. And I'm afraid that's still the case. Every element of digital technology seems to take forever when it comes to the criminal justice system or the justice system more generally. And of course, I mentioned internet access or lack of it. And we need to expand all of these services. I'm a very strong believer, whether you like it or not, in live streaming of all court cases, but for those that are where clearly there are vulnerable victims or vulnerable witnesses. I think unless you shine a light on what happens in our courtrooms, you don't know what's happening in our courtrooms. And I think that would be the game changer, to my mind, about, when Tom talks about his experience in the post office, scandal is one way of putting it, but there are harder words I would use. To many of you, it was a television series that suddenly got the government to take this seriously. Because they saw a visual representation of what happens. Yet others have been writing about it, talking about it for months and years and years and years, yet it didn't seem to have the same traction. I think that by shining a light, literally a visual light, on what happens in courts is the answer. I wrote about it in the Times a few months ago. A lawyer contacted me and said, Nazir, if I wanted to be an actor, I'd have gone to RADA. And he totally misunderstood. It's not about him, it's about you. The citizen, the public gallery, which is where you're meant to go, you don't go. They're empty. You don't know what happens in your name, and my personal view is that you should have the access to do so. Now, 2 minutes. I will finish in 2 minutes by giving you some of the answers. Expand legal aid. Pro bono work needs to be celebrated. I would say it should be mandated for legal firms. Some of them do it. Some of them pick and choose where they do it. Doughty Street don't. They do the good ones. Most of them simply pick and choose the sexy stuff and not the other stuff that needs to be done. Anti-discrimination programs. I've held so many judges to account. I've got judges struck off because of their abusive and their racism in a courtroom, but that's a handful. There is hardly any accountability for judges and lawyers and those in law enforcement when it comes to implicit and cultural competency. The diverse representation is not there. 20 judges approached me 4 or 5 years ago. They can't speak. I had to speak on their behalf. They said that they're being bullied within the judicial profession, that there's nobody speaking for them, and it's quite simply because the system itself isn't diverse enough. Simplify legal processes, more alternative dispute resolution, more mobile courts, more legal clinics, greater use of technology, more accessible facilities, more community education, more school programs, more multilingual resources, more interpreter services, greater support for NGOs, please. They are the backbone of our legal system, of our representation and our citizens' experience. More community legal clinics, more integration of services rather than working in silos, better data collection so that you know where you are and how bad things are and whether improvements are happening. I will assure you that there will be another miscarriage of justice in 5 minutes' time. There'll be another tomorrow, and there'll be another the day after tomorrow, and maybe Sunday's a day off, but no, Monday there'll be one. The point is the system is broken. The point is I have no confidence that the people that are meant to be running it are running it for your benefit, the citizen. And that's why we have to hold their feet to the fire. We've got to present them with the answers, but also ensure that they respond to our questions. And we've got to shine a light on what's going on and not allow the terrible scandals and the thousands and tens of thousands of people that are suffering day in, day out because of the misuse of our system. We need to ensure that they are listened to and the system works for all of us. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Nazir. Can I now invite our panellists to come to the stage, please? And you can take a seat after telling us all about the things that we need to change in our justice system. Okay, so just want to reflect a bit on what you've just said. There's a lot to take in, actually, especially the list of things that we need to change. And in fact, 1989, when you were first practicing, I was studying for my A-level law in the late 1980s. And I was just thinking about the fact that a lot of what I was being taught and the essays we had to write in our A-level law exam, I was listening to you talking about this evening. And in fact, I think we're going backwards, so I think it's worse than what it was in the late 1980s.
I think in the early 2000s, there was money going into the system. So much of our improvements happened between about 2004 and 8 or something, and then of course the financial crash happened. But you can't do this on the cheap.
Yeah, absolutely. And in fact, it was during that time that I got involved in the sort of issues of access to justice, and it's what's driven sort of me professionally and personally throughout my career. And I suppose that, you know, it's the sad thing that we're here today listening to you talking about many of the issues which were prevalent in the late 1980s. And also sort of I was listening to some of the things you were saying about racism and the work that Professor Quinn has done in SALC, and myself and Kim O'Keefe from Garden Court on racism in the judiciary, and the other work that I know that Professor Quinn has done on art not evidence and rap and drill music being used to convict minority communities. So lots of things that sort of I was thinking about when you were talking that we are doing here. And the final thing that I'm sort of thinking about before we go on to talk to the panel and ask the questions is, I was reading Andy Burnham's and Steve Rotherham's book recently, and they were talking about the fact that we need to rewire the UK, and underlying that is the rewiring of the legal system. And that's another thing I think which sort of springs to mind just in that title alone. So when I was reading that book, I was very much thinking about this evening. And it certainly sort of makes me think, well, how can we do this? And I suppose these are some of the questions that I'm going to sort of ask the panel this evening. So over to you first, Tom. And you're a sub-postmaster who's been exonerated. You've had your conviction overturned. And can you tell us about the day that you were wrongfully convicted, and why on that day you pleaded guilty to something which you knew that you hadn't done?
Well, thank you, Claire, and good evening to everybody here and those watching at home. It's obviously etched on my memory, my appearance at Lincoln Crown Court, which incidentally is 48 miles from my home. Prior to obviously going into court, I'd been at Magistrates' Court, but the case was too serious for them to look at. And I did get legal aid, and I did get a lawyer. But even 15 years ago, legal aid was not exactly a lot of money, and it's been eroded ever since. And like all things in life, you get what you pay for. There were only 2 firms locally that did legal aid. So one of the firms, there was a guy I knew worked there as a solicitor. I knew him very well because he'd lived in the village where my shop was and post office. When he moved out, he did a flit, owing me 30-odd pounds, with an outstanding bill that he'd run up in the shop. Never did pay it, so I didn't want to go to him. So I approached the other firm, and they didn't have any capacity. So I ended up with the rogue, and I think it sums it up that I ended up with a rogue lawyer, and he certainly was a rogue because he owed me money. And he wouldn't, of course, he'd totally forgotten that by the time I had my dealings with him. But we discussed the case. And you've got to remember that on the day of my audit, when this nightmare happened, within 10 minutes of them finding the shortfall, the money they claimed I owed them, they changed the alarm codes, they changed the logins on the computer, they took the keys to the safe, to the fortress area away from me. And from that point in, I had nothing. I had no means of getting any information because everything existed within that Horizon system. So bearing that in mind, when you go, and I did go and see this lawyer and we discussed the case, and I said, look, I didn't take this money. I'm absolutely certain it's the Horizon system. And I have complained on hundreds of occasions to anybody within the post office that would listen that that was the case. But nevertheless, the people at the top believed it worked and worked well. And he said, well, look, you're on legal aid. You've no means of getting any special accountants in to look at the figures and all the rest of it. He said, now look, I can tell you here now, if you plead not guilty in that court, you've got no means of defending yourself because you can't get any information. And the jury will not believe that that esteemed, wonderful post office that they all love and have loved for years would have anything other than a bomb-proof computer system. And he said, for the amount of money that they claim you owe, the tally's 4 years in jail. That's a very sobering thing to hear. 4 years. I was 58. He said, the only thing you can do is now damage limitation. Plead guilty, get some good references, let me do some pleading on your behalf, and I'll give you 95% that you have to keep you out of jail. What would you do? It's a fait accompli. It is complete damage limitation. And sure enough, I went in, I pleaded guilty. And then it comes to sentencing, and this is where the justice system can be very cruel. I'm standing in the dock, and the judge says, you've been a very naughty boy, or I'm paraphrasing, obviously, and this is, a thing against the state, an offence against the state, so I'm going to sentence you to 7 months imprisonment. And I'm deliberately pausing because he deliberately paused for a good 30 seconds before saying, but that sentence will be suspended for 2 years. And he let me squirm. That was cruel. Utterly cruel. And that's the reason why I pleaded guilty, because I was backed into a corner. It was like playing poker where I had a mirror behind my head and everybody could see my cards. I had no chance. And I suspect the vast majority well, I know the vast majority of all the other postmasters were backed into a very similar corner. And yes, the system is broken because the people in power, if you like, hold all the cards. And we mere minions, we're just confetti that can be thrown into the air and hopefully the wind will blow away.
Professor Justin Brooks, a friend of mine who runs a project in the US, he says it's like a roulette game where the stakes are just so high, it's unquantifiable stakes.
I mean, the other thing that got me on that day, when he'd given the sentence, and he said, oh, and we'll charge you £1,000 costs for post offices, costs for bringing that. And the barrister for the post office, who was there with his second person, his junior, and I had a solicitor advocate. They actually claimed for £4,000. But give my guy his due, and it's about the only good thing he did for me. He did say that's disproportionate, given that you knew my client was going to plead guilty before we even came here today. And the judge did drop that down to £1,000. But having been kicked, they then kick you again. And it's just, yeah.
Okay, and moving on to being kicked and kicked again. The post office, which you said they took the keys off you and so on, but you still had the shop, which was attached to the post office. And after you were convicted, you had to deliver newspapers in your local village with your face on the front of those newspapers. How did that make you feel, and what was the reaction from people in the village?
Well, of course, you see, the village where our shop and home was about 1,000 people. So you knew everybody by sight. You knew most of them by name. And it was awful, because the following week we were all over the front page of the local paper. What a terrible man. I was accused of stealing the pensioners' pensions. That's how the local paper put it. And to have my name and all this all over the front page of the local paper, and then to have to go and put that through people's letterboxes, oh, it's so humiliating. I mean, half the village couldn't believe it and were very supportive, but the other half thought I was an utter rogue. And you say we had a shop. Within 4 months of my conviction, we had to shut the shop because all the footfall had just dropped away. It was unprofitable. We were in sort of dire straits. Maxed out every credit card we had. We were literally living hand to mouth. It was really bad.
So, my final question to you, Tom, is that perhaps some of us have seen the iconic picture of you outside the court, and you've got a bottle of fizz in your hand and other sub-postmasters are around you. What did it feel like the day that you had your conviction overturned?
Well, I have to give a great big thanks to the CCRC, who gave me a great deal of help to get my case, along with the other 39 people on the day. And we ended up in the Court of Appeal down in London on the Strand there. And I knew we'd been told that it was going our way. And the couple of days before, I'd been to see my mother, who was about 92 at the time. Sadly, she's passed away now, but that's by the by. And she asked me to go and do a bit of shopping for her. And she said, I want you to go to Aldi, and here's the shopping list. Now, I understand you're going to London and you're having your conviction overturned next week. And I said, yeah, that's right. She said, right. Well, while you're getting my shopping with my bank card, she said, buy a bottle of Prosecco, they do a good one for $4.99. She said, just remember, now I want you to open that when you come out of court. She said, just remember that your name is Hedges, not Rothschild. So don't get their champagne, that's $9.99. And that's, but I mean, it was a wonderful day to sit there in court. If you watch the drama, I was sitting next to Noel Thomas when the lead judge there started reading out the names of all the people that had been acquitted, and it was just wonderful. It's up there with the day I got married. I was so happy at that, and the day both my children were born and I was given those little bundles of joy. It's up there with that. That's how wonderful it was. And I was so pleased for the other 700 or 800 people that had their appeal, their convictions quashed just a fortnight ago in the last session of Parliament, when that headlining bill to get them all cleared out went through. But it'll never, for them it's great, they'll get a piece of paper through the post telling them that's the case, but it's not quite the same as being there and having the judge, because courtrooms are intimidating places, and they're grand places, and certainly the High Courts of Justice in London are a fabulous building if you've ever been there, for the right reasons. They're horrible when they're for the wrong reasons, but no, it was absolutely brilliant.
Okay, thanks, Tom. Okay, so over to you, Suzanne, for some questions. Before you started your PhD, in full disclosure, Suzanne is my PhD student and now also a colleague because she's a lecturer with us as well. And before that, you had a very successful career as a solicitor. You were managing director of appeal, and I don't know if anyone saw the documentary last night on Andy Malkinson's conviction being overturned, but that's the charity that Suzanne headed up. And you also worked on the Hillsborough inquiry. And going back to what I said about Andy Burnham and Steve Rotherham's book, when they spoke about rewiring the UK legal system, they also talked in that book about a duty of candour, because they talk a lot about Hillsborough, and a duty to put parties, and this is something that you talked about as well, Nazir, on an equal footing to fund access to justice, because that is very problematic. And I suppose this goes back to what you were talking about as well, Tom, in terms of that disparity and being able to defend yourself. So they talked about that parity of funding, and another example would be in inquests where there is that parity between the public body and the families involved. So how far do you think, so this is my first question, how far do you think we're off from coming to the stage where we will have a Hillsborough law, a duty of candour and parity of funding? And do you think that it was a critical factor in the families not getting justice earlier in the original inquests when we're talking about, well, not just Hillsborough, I suppose we're talking about all the things that you've mentioned tonight, the infected blood scandal, Grenfell, which we'll talk about later, and so on. Yeah. So that's my first question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, firstly, I think it sounds quite ridiculous to people to suggest that we need a law to tell people to tell the truth. Aren't we all taught that by our parents when we're very, very young?
Yeah, but we all break it.
Yeah. But
have you eaten that sweet? No.
But most of us move on from that, and I think that a lot of people were reluctant the idea that there should have to be a lawful duty saying to people, you know what, you have to tell the truth here. You've got to come clean. You've got to put your hands up. You've got to say, yes, I did eat the sweet, essentially. But when you look at the scandals that we've spoken about here, the common theme in Hillsborough, in Grenfell, in the post office cases, in all of that, it is the fact that the institutions who had actively harmed people, who were involved in causing harm, hid the evidence of that. They hold all the cards in the sense of disclosing the information, whether it's Hillsborough, the police taking the statements at the time and choosing to alter the statements. The police officers on the scene at Hillsborough were told, don't write everything down in your police officer's notebook as you have done from the moment you began your job. No. Write your notes separately, and we will then have a team go through them and tell you which bits of that should make their way into your statement. So the bits where the fans were behaving badly, yeah, you need to write that in. Anything where the police might have been seen to do anything wrong, no, that's not to go in your statement. And so by holding the cards, by controlling the information, they get to set the course of the narrative of what goes on. And if we focus on the original inquests that took place in 1990, 1991, just after the disaster, the truth about the reason that those people died on that day was known, because the Lord Taylor's report at the time had uncovered so much of the truth about the mistakes that were made, that the actions that took place, and opening the gate, all the structural issues that caused the disaster. But that didn't come out in the inquest. And the two key reasons for that are the fact that the families were not told the truth because the information was withheld from them. And secondly, because there was no equality of arms and the families were not represented. So as Tom said, that how he felt in court when the post office, unlimited funds for legal representation, the same for the police, the same for all these other organisations we've spoken about. But in the original Hillsborough inquest, the families didn't have legal aid for representation at all. A few of the families could contribute a small amount of money to pay for a barrister who did some work, but the vast majority of them, they were working class families by and large. They didn't have money to pay for lawyers, and that meant that they had to represent themselves. And they did an incredible job, people who'd never set foot in a courtroom of any kind, having to suddenly represent their children, their brothers, their mothers, their fathers, and try and stand up for their interests in an inquest, which was far more adversarial than it should have been. But the fact that they weren't represented meant that they didn't know what questions to ask, and they didn't stand a hope in hell of getting to the truth of why the people had died that day. And that was clearly one of the factors that led to those inquests coming to a finding of accidental death. And the Hillsborough disaster was no accident. And so the families could not accept that. And it took 27 years of fighting for them to get justice and to get those inquest verdicts overturned and to get the new verdicts of unlawful killing, which accurately reflected what happened to the 97 people that day. And so the Hillsborough law, which has been campaigned for by the Hillsborough families, but they've also joined together with the infected blood families, Grenfell, so many other people are coming together to say, ideally, there would never be another disaster in this country. No one's going to die in these circumstances. But that's not reality. These things are always going to happen. And so we have to have a system that can adequately deal with it when it does, where we tell the truth, where we tell people this is why your loved one died, and these are the actions that we're going to take to stop it from happening to people again in the future. Because in the vast majority of these cases, that's what the families want. They're not out for blood. They're not out for people to lose their jobs and go to prison. They want the truth, and they want to know it will never happen again. Now, there are cases where people deserve to go to prison, don't get me wrong. But by and large, the Hillsborough law, the duty of candour, is about taking some of the heat out of that situation, making things fairer. We're here to talk about equality, and that's what we need in the system. We need to know that if you are the victim, if something terrible goes wrong to you or someone you love, that you have a chance of getting justice for them.
Okay, and do you think we're far off that? It's a loaded question.
Again, I know we have to be careful. There's an election coming up. The Labour Party have promised that if they are to get in power, and if we are to believe the electoral polls, there is a reasonable chance of that happening. They have said they will introduce legislation to bring in a duty of candour. Whether the law that gets passed is one that the families are happy with, who knows? We know how these things have a tendency to happen. But I am reasonably hopeful that we may end up with some form of a duty of candour. But I will hold my views on whether or not the law that's passed
You'll
is
believe
adequate.
it when you see it.
Yeah, good final point on that question, Tom. So my next question, and one which we talk about a lot, so we're turning to access to justice in the criminal justice system. And I'm talking mainly post-conviction. Yep. Now, so Nazir talked a lot about sort of pre-conviction, but I'm talking about post-conviction. And you teach miscarriages of justice here, and you worked for appeal. What do you think are the main issues, the problematic issues with post-conviction in the criminal justice system?
Okay, there's really nowhere near enough time for me to give my true answer on this. But the fact is, when someone like Tom finds themselves in a situation where they've been convicted of an offence that they didn't commit, the prospects of them being able to undo that harm and overturn their conviction are incredibly, incredibly slight. The system, as we've spoken about, is so broken in terms of the pre-trial situation. It's worse once you have been convicted. It's so much harder to get the system to acknowledge its errors and to reverse it. When it works well, as Tom's found, that the Criminal Cases Review Commission is the independent body that was set up after the Birmingham 6 cases and the series of miscarriages of justice in the late 80s, early 90s. And their role is to investigate alleged miscarriages of justice and send them back to the Court of Appeal and say, you need to have another look. We think that there may have been a miscarriage of justice here. We think this conviction is unsafe. Less than 2% of the people who apply to them get their cases, as Tom did. As I say, when it works well, it can be the difference, and it can, but they are the body who have had the biggest cuts to their budget within the Ministry of Justice, and the Ministry of Justice is the government department who've had the biggest cuts to their budget throughout. So when you look at everything else that doesn't work, believe me when I tell you that the CCRC is in worse state than all of them because they've had bigger cuts to their budget. So the chances are, I don't know if anyone got to see, there was a documentary last night on BBC Two about the case of Andrew Malkinson and the charity who I used to work for, Appeal. If you haven't watched it, watch it on the iPlayer. It's a really good documentary. It tells the story of a man who was wrongly convicted and spent over 17 years in prison for a crime he hadn't committed. And it gives some indication of how hard it is to get that conviction overturned and the damage that it does. I was so proud of Andy, and that he was so open and so vulnerable with the crew who made the documentary, and I think it gave a really, really good insight into what a wrongful conviction can do to somebody. But he had 3 applications. He was in prison for 17 years for a crime he hadn't committed, and he had 3 applications to the CCRC, and he kept saying, I didn't do this. There is DNA on the victim's clothing. It is not my DNA. Will you please do some tests and find out whose DNA it is? And they kept saying no. They kept saying it's not cost efficient. We don't think this is going to work. They weren't interested. And he was in prison for 17 years before he was released on parole. And then it took a further 3 years. It was July last year that his conviction was overturned because the charity Appeal that I used to work for managed to get access to the clothing, essentially, and get the testing done. And they found out that it wasn't his DNA, but it was the DNA that did belong to somebody who was on the police national database. That person hasn't been charged with the offence, but when Andrew's case was overturned in July last year, the Court of Appeal said the person whose DNA it was fitted the description better than Andrew Malkinson did, lived in the area, didn't have an alibi for the night in question, and had relevant previous convictions. That wasn't the person that the police sought to prosecute for the crime. It was an entirely innocent man. So it shouldn't have taken a very small charity having to intervene in that case, and it took 4 or 5 years from the moment Andrew first approached appeal to get that conviction overturned, when it was so obvious to anyone who looked at it that that was an innocent man sitting rotting in a prison cell. And I think that case gives it a really good idea of quite how hard it is. We've spoken about funding, about the fact that legal aid is really, really hard to get before you're convicted. Once you have been convicted, the circumstances in which you'll be eligible for legal aid are even more limited. Because it's such a difficult area, very, very few practitioners doing it are prepared to do that work anymore. So many have walked away from it. So you have a situation where people are left in a situation where they have been wrongly convicted and they have nowhere to turn. So if there's one thing I could do about that, it would be put an awful lot more money in the system at every level. Let's try and avoid the wrongful convictions happening, but let's accept that they do. There are human beings involved in the criminal justice system, which means we're always going to make mistakes. And let's get a lot better at admitting our mistakes and trying to rectify them.
Yep. And apologising.
Yes.
Okay, so thanks, Suzanne. So over to you, Dalia. And you've also been involved in high-profile cases in the UK. So the COVID inquiry being one of them, the Grenfell inquiry. And what have you identified as the major barriers to achieving justice for marginalised communities, and what steps do you think need to be taken to overcome these barriers? I know we've sort of touched on this, but
So I actually met Susanna during my representation of bereaved families in Hillsborough.
Yeah.
Suzanne was representing one group of bereaved families and I was representing another. And like Suzanne, I also call for a legislated duty of candor. Legislation that puts public authorities to account, for there to be disclosure in a timely manner, and also for there to be equality of arms through funding. Tom spoke about the passage of time. Suzanne spoke about the 27 years. Nazir has spoken about delays. Justice delayed is justice denied. And a common theme in Hillsborough, Grenfell, in fact, in 2017, it was a year after we got the conclusions in Hillsborough that put to bed the false narrative that had run for over 20 years against the fans, the families, and the people of Liverpool, that it was the fans to blame. And as one of the lawyers representing the families, not being from England, I'm Jamaican, and not living in England at the time, it really struck my core that a system could be so unjust, that it had a city and families who lost their children, their loved ones, hanging in such state, living with this hanging over their heads for so long. And it really, really struck me. I thought, my God, having had that watershed moment that I experienced, like Tom, you know, when he had that moment in the Court of Appeal, when I was with the families, as Suzanne was, in Warrington when we got the verdicts, I remember the families jumping for joy when they got unlawful killing, but equally so when the question came back from the jury that the fans weren't to blame. And I thought England couldn't have, you know, another disaster where you have a system of delay and a state where you do not have systems in place for there to be immediate investigation that will deliver answers and justice for victims. And here I was in June, the 14th of June 2017. I was actually in Jamaica. And I was watching on I think it was CNN, this fire in West London. And I remember I was in my aunt's house and she said, you know, that's London. And I was like, oh my goodness. And I was on WhatsApp to my friends in England and, you know, we spoke about what was happening. And when I got back to London a couple of weeks later, I remember going down to the community to pay my respects. And I just could not believe that this was 2017. It felt like England was repeating 1989, where the victims of a huge disaster in one of the wealthiest boroughs in the world had to be coming together. You know, ordinary citizens, just like the Hillsborough families, had to be coming together, campaigning for justice. You know, like the Hillsborough Family Support Group, like the Hillsborough Justice Campaign, Grenfell United, and the other Grenfell campaigning groups were born out of ordinary people seeking answers for justice. And I think it's actually disgraceful that we have a system which is not fit for purpose because it does not deliver justice to victims in a timely manner. In the 21st century in England, victims should not be suffering and having their grief and bereavement and sense of injustice compounded by the failure of the state to bring accountability. This will be 7 years since the fire, and we're expecting the report in September. And we've heard that criminal proceedings will need, or the outcome of criminal investigations will need to await the report and then, you know, further investigations into that. Nazir, you spoke about, you know, the review of the LFB. When you have such a delay in bringing, you know, criminal investigations, it will impact on the sense of justice that the victims feel is delivered. It will invariably impact on the state of the investigation. And I think that we also need to have a system that delivers criminal prosecutions arising from what we see, mass disaster, mass failings, in a more timely manner. Infected blood, how many years? So, you know, coupled with Suzanne's call for legislation that brings in a duty of candor, we must have a system that ensures the delivery of justice for victims in a much more timely manner.
Yeah, absolutely. It consumes people's lives, and it's everyone involved, isn't it? It consumes
it makes them
your life
ill. It makes them ill.
Absolutely, and I met someone, albeit in the USA, at a conference, and Suzanne was there as well, and he'd been in prison for 52 years and wrongly convicted. And I couldn't take it in for a while because that's how old I am, so it was my whole life. He went to prison in his 20s, and he was now in his 70s, and he'd been in prison that whole time, and he still hadn't had that apology that he was seeking. But yeah, so it's the passage of time again.
And also, you mentioned apology because, you know, so many of the Grenfell families, they wanted the apology, the acceptance of wrongdoing from the RBKC and the TMO.
Yeah.
And it was just not forthcoming.
And sort of my final question before we move to audience questions then. So one of our research beacons at the University of Manchester is global inequalities. And you've done a lot of international work as well as your domestic work. Can you tell us a bit about the work you're doing in East Africa and also the work you've done for the Barbadian people?
The
Barbudan people,
yes,
sorry.
Yes. Well, you know.
I'm going to Barbados at some point.
Well, I actually did my degree.
It's in my head.
I did my degree at the University of the West Indies, and I lived in Barbados for 2 years. So I'm a very much Caribbean person.
It's a Barbudan, yes,
Barbuda.
the Barbudan people.
Yes. So My involvement with Barbuda actually also came about in 2017 following the passage of Hurricane Irma, which devastated the island that has under 10,000 people. And effectively, there was this hurricane, and Barbuda is a part of a twin island state, Antigua and Barbuda, in the Eastern Caribbean. And the seat of government is based in the capital of Antigua, and the government evacuated the people from the island over to the mainland. But this was just the beginning of very, very sad days for Barbuda, because what unfolded was a plan to dismantle a system of communal land ownership that the people of Barbuda enjoyed up to then, and to turn over the land on the island to private ownership. Now, we talk about, I don't know if anybody here or the research center looks at disaster capitalism, which a journalist, well-known journalist, Naomi Klein, I think she's written pieces about. This was just disaster capitalism unfolding, where you have a disaster. Barbuda has really, really beautiful beaches. You know, it's just pristine waters and lovely people. And what the government saw was an opportunity to remove the people from the island and to go into arrangements or bring to full fruition arrangements with private investors, you know, including celebrities whose names I won't really mention on the stage, but surprising, you know, celebrity names who had invested into ventures on the island for these, you know, developments, all-inclusive type exclusive properties that exclude the people of the island from access to the land. So that's how my involvement came about. And it actually has culminated more recently with a landmark Privy Council judgment on access to justice. Because as a part of, you know, the plan to develop the island, the government proceeded with private investors to take steps to build an airport, whilst the people of the island had been evacuated from the island. And environmental systems were not in place. No EIA was done. The plans for the airport was being undertaken, or the airport was to be undertaken on limestone areas. Of course, we know that's not stable. And so two Barbudans took on the case. And we talk about access to justice being access to funding, you know, legal aid. It's a global problem, particularly so in countries in the global south, you know, like the Caribbean, like African countries. And so Garden Court, members of Garden Court, have been supporting a number of Barbudans in this fight. And it's become a huge environmental challenge, because there was, you know, it's little David's up against the Goliath of the state. And one of the arguments that the government brought in opposition to the legal challenge, environmental challenge against the construction of the airport was, you two Barbudans who live on this really small island that are saying that you will be affected by an airport do not have standing, because you won't be directly affected. And really, really important Privy Council judgment, Mussington against the government of Antigua. If any of the students want to look at it on the Privy Council website, ruled that for environmental challenges, ordinary citizens have standing, And it's really important because as we move forward in an age where the climate, we are facing an existential crisis because of climate change, environmental activism is now more important than ever. And this went across the Atlantic to East Africa because my work there, again, you know, pro bono, garden court assistance with another NGO that's based here, International Lawyers Project, that has represented indigenous and minority communities. We worked together in February of this year with communities in the Maasai people. I don't know if people know of the Maasai communities in East Africa, in Kenya and Tanzania. We worked with some of the community members in Kenya. And we also did some work with the Ogiek community. They are a hunter and gatherer group who were historically based and lived in the Mau forest region of Kenya. And the issue that these communities, where indigenous community face, is that the state, private entities, similar to Barbuda, have an agenda to take their lands that they have held in traditional communities with indigenous practices for private development. And a big part of this, of course, impacts on the environment because there are developments that are earmarked and are taking place. The community is not engaged. The community is not informed of developments that are earmarked and, you know, are to take place on their lands or their adjoining lands, a lot of which may very well have harmful environmental consequences for the communities. And so it was really about engaging with the communities, informing them, and enabling them and empowering them to assert their rights, particularly as they face developments and environmental challenges. So it's sort of come full circle, but you know, it just shows the importance of the global community in this time to work together to protect the environment.
Yeah, and listen, this goes back to what you were saying, Nazir, about pro bono work and how important it is, obviously nationally and globally. Okay, so thanks everyone, and now it's an opportunity to open up questions to the audience, if I may. So, do you want to ask a question first?
My question is to Nazir. Is it on? Hi, so my question is to Nazir. My name's Jawad. I'm an ex-Manchester student. I work as a GP now. So why is it in 2024 we still have this statistic of 9 times more likely? And why is there no political appetite to challenge this? And what do you think will ever get to the stage where justice is served equally irrespective of race?
Well, I think, well, I'm always optimistic that at some point we will get to the stage, but the reason I said it is I'm alarmed that we haven't had any significant improvement. And actually, the fact we've gone backwards, I think we've touched on it earlier on, because of the lack of resources in the system, we've gone backwards. So if the government say, right, we want you to tackle crime in a particular community, which is disproportionately black or Asian, police go in there with one approach to arrest, stop, search, rather than thinking, well, actually crime happens everywhere and they shouldn't just focus on one community. So to answer your question, I don't know the answer. I do think, you know, we're probably going to be asked later on about what the university could do, a university could do. The more research we do in this field, the more evidence that supports this. Because sometimes when I use that figure, somebody comes back and says, well, it's actually 7 times right now. You know, as if somehow that's a fantastic improvement, you know. So the more research we have in this field, the better we'll be able to push back on those people who think it isn't a problem. But to answer your question, will we ever get there? Yes, I hope. But it comes down to what others have said about proper funding.
We must get there.
Sorry, can I just come in on that point? Because I think that the use of joint enterprise laws contributes to the significant number of black young people in particular who are in the criminal justice system, and we really need to rethink and relook at the laws relating to joint enterprise, and I think that's a very important aspect of working towards that sort of reduction in the overrepresentation of black people in the criminal justice system.
Yeah, absolutely. And coupled with the use of evidence against certain communities as well, like the use
Art
of
Not Evidence campaign.
Yeah, rap and drill music and the Art Not Evidence campaign, you know, it's critical really, because it's just the different factors together make a huge difference.
It doesn't help that there's no black chief constables. It doesn't help that there are no, if the representation is not there at the top, well, things are not going to change overnight, are they?
And I think there's a question there. I think somebody had a hand up there, and then the gentleman there. So,
I just want, like you, Nazir, I'm an optimist. We may have a prime minister soon who is legally literate. Am I expecting too much to hope that we have a home secretary at some stage who will be legally literate as well? How can they be legally literate?
It's impossible to answer that question without being political. I've worked with some people who might be in government in 3 weeks' time, and they are legally literate. So I'm hopeful. One has to be hopeful. But when you start appointing people to roles who've got no experience of that area, and then they rely upon 23-year-old special advisors, no disrespect to any 23-year-olds in the room, but the point is, you need experience, you need knowledge, you need access to knowledge, and so we used to have, the only people that would be law chancellors were people who were, 30 years in the law, that kind of stuff, rather than somebody that's just walked in out of bar school. No disrespect, the current one.
If I could just add it, that Claire and I teach miscarriages of justice here, and there are very few textbooks that have been written on the topic of miscarriage of justice. So one of the books that we still use is one that was written about 20 years ago by a professor at the University of Leeds and one of his former students who was a young radical human rights lawyer by the name of Keir Starmer. So he literally wrote the book on miscarriages of justice. He knows they exist. He knows a lot of what needs to be done to fix them. Is it going to be top of his priority list if he walks into Downing Street? I very much doubt it. But as you say, he is someone who we can say absolutely knows the issues because he literally wrote the book on them.
Yep. Okay, so another question. I think we've got a question there, and yep.
Hi. I think that there's quite a big taboo against going against large corporations and groups, similar to the saying "Do you know who I am?" How do we encourage accountability and go against this?
Power has always corrupted, and absolute power corrupts, doesn't it? We've been quite successful in recent years around sexual misconduct, for example. You've seen some Hollywood superstars and others who finally been brought to book for what they've done for decades on end. But we haven't even mentioned the financial crash. That destroyed tens of thousands of lives, and there have been 2 convictions, and both of them are currently appealing. So Hillsborough, we've had one health and safety conviction. If I remember rightly. We've had none for infected blood. We've obviously not had, apart from the miscarriages in post office, we had none for post office. So I think the worm has to turn, and that everybody should, the whole point of the law was it applies to everyone. And there may well be some solutions that we might touch on in a minute or two that will enable the powerful to be held to the same standard that the rest of us are held to.
Anyone else want to add to that? Or?
Well, I think that, there needs to be legislative teeth to ensure that, corporations they don't elude justice, particularly following mass disasters. The health and safety legislation in some ways encompasses that. But paying a fine, a corporation paying a fine, you know, when you have human failing contributing to deaths or systemic failings is quite a difficult pill for victims to swallow. So I do think that there needs to be some legislative change in that respect.
I just want to throw something in here. In health and safety law, if something terrible happens and somebody loses an arm or the worst case gets killed in a workplace situation, the actual health and safety manager, director, call him or her what you will, it's them personally that gets hauled up into court, and they can go to prison. We've had that in our law here for 20 plus years, and over that period, thankfully, the incidence of that type of thing happening has plummeted, because all companies know that the bosses themselves can be called to account. Now, surely there's a lesson that should be learned from that when it comes to the other things that we're talking about, where people are obfuscating the truth and not offering all the information and all the ramifications that run from it. If the law stated that the bosses end up in jail, or never mind fining a corporation or a body millions of pounds, the bosses have to pay as well. I tell you what, it square things up pretty quick, I think.
Okay, I think there's somebody there that wants to ask a question.
Hi. I wondered whether any of you think there is a role, or could be a role, or should be a role in improving access to the law for trade unions, because I think trade unions are substantial commissioners of legal services on behalf of ordinary people. Now, mostly that's to do with health and safety, but I don't know that it necessarily has to be limited to health and safety. And I think that the good thing about health and safety isn't so much the people who get prosecuted, it's the damages that get awarded to victims. But the other thing that's relevant, I think, to workplace is the importance that you've pointed out about whistleblowers, because I think it's all very well to present whistleblowers with a duty to tell the truth and disclose whatever it is and give them a duty. But most whistleblowers most significant whistleblowers are employees in a workplace, and they're afraid of the consequences. And it's the trade unions that can protect them from the consequences, and protecting them from the consequences of saying what needs to be said is probably more to the point than giving them a duty to tell it. So, you know, where do you see trade unions fitting into the path of making this situation better?
That one then.
Well, I mean,
Talia?
if I can just weigh in on that question in this way, I have seen firsthand the value of the work of trade unions in the COVID inquiry. So the TUC has been given interested person status in the COVID inquiry. And I tell you, one of the challenges that the TUC has faced is that they haven't gotten funding. They haven't gotten, you know, they don't have that pool of funds to mount a full representation and you know, fund a full complement of legal team. But, and I don't know if you have been following the COVID inquiry at all during the module 1, which is the pre-pandemic preparation, and module 2, which has been the decision-making phase.
I think your mic isn't working. So.
My mic isn't working. Oh dear. Thank you. Better?
Yes.
Thank you. But so we have seen a lot of material coming out from the trade union to the inquiry. It's all in the public on the support, the warnings, the cautions that they have given, and the exposure and risk that workers who are members of the trade union faced during COVID. And some of the workers who've given statements and evidence and material that we've seen in the inquiry are, would fall into that category of whistleblowers. So I absolutely support proper funding for trade unions, because their members are really at the heart of evidence gathering, lobbying, and information. And again, with Grenfell, the FBU and MATRAC have been very, very instrumental in bringing to light some of the failings in the LFB and ways that things need to be improved, particularly with the impact of austerity. That's been a main theme that the trade unions have carried in calling for accountability where we have these huge failings.
Okay, thanks. Do you want to add to that? Or? Yep. Okay. Okay, so that's all the questions we've got time for, but I just wanted to ask you all a final question. So we've finished with our audience questions because we're running out of time. And this is a question to you all. So in the areas that we've talked about this evening, what do you hope our sort of third century of the University of Manchester will bring in this area? What do you hope might change or get better? Thalia, Suzanne?
You want me to start?
Yes, go ahead. You may as well go this way.
Well, I mean, Nazir touched on research. Universities are, research centers. Your law faculty, I'm hoping that you produce radical lawyers who will carry on the fight for justice, because you've got to be radical to fight for change. And it's not an easy road. I hope that the university will build on its development support. I look forward to perhaps having more conversations with you guys around climate justice and environmental protections and safeguard. But I mean, my takeaway from this is continued your work on the overrepresentation of and racial inequality and injustice in the criminal justice system, the work you've done with Keir Monteith of my chambers on racism in the judiciary, and your project, Professor Quinn on art not evidence, and the use of music, black music.
Yep.
So more research, radical lawyers.
Yeah. Tom.
Well, I think this is my fourth visit to the university, and the one thing that I always are very heartened with whenever I sit in a room here, certainly when it's mainly students as the audience, is the fact that it's at least 50-50 male and female. In some of the classes it's 70 female and 30 male. And every colour under the sun, every race appears to be representative. So I think there's a great start for that dissemination and the breaking down of this culture that exists certainly within legal system in this country of sort of old white middle-aged men like me. And yeah, long may that continue. And when those students take up their positions as lawyers and start working for firms, hopefully all that will take through. And I mean, all the time I come, I always talk about miscarriage of justice, because unfortunately I'm an expert on that. And for the students to be aware of all these things that can go and do go wrong with our system.
Okay, Suzanne.
Yeah, well, I think obviously there's the two key themes at the university. We've got research and we've got teaching. And just to focus a little bit on the teaching, that when I was a trainee solicitor, the partner I worked for told me that the most important thing she was going to do for me was to turn me cynical. And I like that we do that with the students before they even go into practice. We teach miscarriages of justice as a module. So we're teaching them right from the get-go that it is a far from perfect system, and we show them all the things that have gone wrong with the system and the harm that can be done. And I think that goes a long way to turning out the right type of radical lawyer that Thalia was talking about. The best lawyer that I ever worked for was a man named Elkin Abrahamson, who in Liverpool, he was the lawyer who represented the Hillsborough families. He worked on that case for about 27 years, and he got paid for maybe 2 years of those 27 because he represented a woman called Anne Williams, and he fought so hard for year after year. He was banging his head against a brick wall trying to get justice for the families. Now, Elkin, his mantra as a lawyer is that you have to make the law work for your client, and if the law doesn't work for your client, get the law changed. And that's how he goes about his practice. And I like to think that at Manchester we're training the next generation of lawyers who are going to have that attitude, who are not going to just sit there and accept all of these inequalities and injustices, and are going to go about trying to change the law.
I mean, I endorse all of that. I mean, as Chancellor, of course I will. Manchester is the home of the cooperative movement. It's the home of the Peterloo Massacre, the social activism, the home of the suffragette movement. If it hasn't happened in Manchester, it hasn't happened anywhere else. So I think that has to be said straight off. In addition to what Suzanne said about teaching and research, the third core goal is, of course, social development. And we are number 1 in Europe and number 2 in the world for universities in meeting the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And that's all about ensuring that what we do impacts and the impact it has on our communities. And I hope we do much more of that, that we remain, we're the only university in the world to be in the top 10 since the league table was created. And I hope that we will always remain number 1 and number 2, because we recognise that we're not in a vacuum, that we are part of the communities of the northwest of England, we're a part of the communities in the United Kingdom, and we're part of the global community.
Okay, and I believe I'm to answer this question as well. So my hope is, and myself and Suzanne work on the Manchester Innocence Project, is we overturn convictions in the next century, hopefully sooner rather than later. So that's the first thing. And as chair, I'm use my prerogative to have a second wish, and that is that on the 11th of June, the decision is being made on whether people who are victims of miscarriages of justice get compensation or not in Neelum and Hallam, so that the Grand Chamber are handing that down on the 11th of June. And that's my second wish, June. That's my second wish, is that it goes in their favour, and that victims of wrongful convictions, not the post office cases, because that's separate, other victims get compensation and get the compensation they deserve to rebuild their lives. So, I think that we're ending things there, and invite Luke back up to close.
Well, let me wrap up with 3 short phrases that we've heard this evening. One that Thalia was talking about a lot was sense of injustice. I think those are good words, because it shows that it's something that you feel as well as understand cognitively, and I'm sure we've felt it as we've heard all the cases from our panels this afternoon. The second one was shine a light, and that's the purpose of Talk 200, and I really do feel some very important lights have been shone today. The last one was rewiring the justice system. That we haven't done, but perhaps there's some pointers for those who are going to do it. And as some have hinted, there's another ex-chief prosecutor out there, and maybe we should put our hopes in that. Thank you all, Nazir, Claire, Tom, Thalia and Suzanne, for your brilliant insights.
To stay up to date with everything Talk 200, be sure to follow and subscribe to the series on the podcasting platform of your choice. Head to manchester.ac.uk/200 to find out more about this series and all the activity taking place across our bicentenary year. Use the hashtag UOM200 to engage with Talk 200 and our wider bicentenary celebrations on social media. Thank you for joining us for this episode of Talk 200, a University of Manchester series.